A very warm welcome, everyone. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor-at-large at Reuters, based out of London, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. From Glasgow to Sharm El Sheikh, how will COP27 reshape the global energy landscape? Hosted by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with Refinitiv and LSEG business. Just a few very brief housekeeping rules before we kick off. For any technical issues, refresh the page. If the problem persists, go to the best viewing experience section above the media player. Any questions for our speakers, click on Ask a Question, and I will get to as many of those as I can. We'll probably go to Q&A in the last 15 minutes or so. But look, if you do have questions, just send them through and I'll try and weave them into our discussion. We are going to have 3 or 4 polling questions throughout this webinar. We'll bring the results to you and react to those results, and we will have a recording of the session available using the same link. Just a few words of context setting here. COP26 in November 21 yielded several breakthrough agreements, including the Global Methane Pledge, the Zero Emission Vehicle Pledge, the Deforestation Pledge, and the Glasgow Pact. Under the Glasgow Pact, countries agreed to revisit, to strengthen their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, in 22 rather than every 5 years. Indeed, several countries have since committed to more ambitious emission reduction goals in an effort to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5%. However, while progress has been made, only, I believe, 24 countries now out of 194 have updated their indices so far. And of these, only a handful are some larger economies. Moreover, only a few have made a tangible upward increase or adjustment to their emission reduction targets. So a lot remains to be done. The latest geopolitical tensions, in particular, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, along with the inflationary environment, the environmental issues that we're experiencing, have undoubtedly been a distraction to governments around the world. But while all of this has slowed down the green energy transition momentum and weighed heavily on national budgets, they have also brought energy security, food security, and climate resilience to the fore. Right, on to COP27. This has been described as perhaps not pivotal like Glasgow, more of a transitionary piece about optimizing resources, improving synergies between governments to encourage implementation rather than take on new commitments. The Egyptian presidency has already outlined mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration as the 4 objectives of COP27. And of course, given the summit is taking place in Africa, only the 5th time it's being held on this continent, we can also expect a greater focus on issues for the global south and the developing world, the establishment in particular of a loss and damage fund. Right, I will stop talking. We're going to address all of these things with our panelists, who I'll introduce now. David Hone is Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell International. Johnathan Shopley is Managing Director, External Affairs at Climate Impact Partners. And Jill Duggan, Executive Director at the Environmental Defence Fund Europe. A very warm welcome to all of you. Before we get into the discussion, into the debate, let me just ask Johnathan to say a few words of scene setting, and then we'll get stuck in. So, Johnathan, the floor is yours. Hi, Johnathan. You might be muted.
Thanks very much, Axel. I was just saying thank you, and what a pleasure it is to be here with you this morning. And if you could go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to provide a bit of a scene setter and perhaps pick up on a number of the points, Axel, that you've already made. This may look like a fairly perplexing image, mushrooms with the globe, which was the logo to the Glasgow COP behind that. And but what the reason why I think this is such a powerful image in terms of the COPs is that normally what happens is we get to COP season, and then the mushroom, which of course is the fruiting body of the mycelium that make up fungi, sort of bursts into view. I live on the edge of the Ashdown Forest here in the south of England, and we can see people out mushrooming around this time of year. But of course, what happens is we get these glorious fungi, and then and there's a lot of attention paid to them, and we try and gather up any snippets of evidence that we really are making progress towards the Paris Agreement's ultimate target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as you mentioned, there was a raft of encouraging commitments and a lot of progress actually made on some of the technical aspects to stand up the Paris Agreement. Article 6 in particular, around the sort of collaborative mechanisms enabled by carbon markets. But here are, and you mentioned a couple of them, the Global Methane Pledge, the Glasgow Climate Pact. But what we really have found is that once the Glasgow mushroom died back, and the mycelium, which is all of these pledges and commitments, but not to forget the primary one that countries make, the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, work then goes a little bit underground, as it were, as the mycelium and all of these partnerships and connections sort of carry on the work and move energy around the system and hopefully make some progress. And I think you've hinted to the fact that in this past year, and if I could go to the next slide, please. In this last year, we've had exogenous shocks that have really probably undermined the energy and the enthusiasm that we saw at Glasgow. But I just wanted to point out, again, I'm just going to use the image of the Sharm El Sheikh COP on the left-hand side of your slide there. And instead of having a mushroom there, what that is a stylized oak tree, which under which many mushrooms grow. But ideally, what we're looking for is evidence that COPs are not just mushrooms that blush and bloom once a year, but they really put in place very sturdy and resilient mechanisms to transform particularly the energy landscape. So just picking up a couple of points that will affect the outcomes and our expectations going into Sharm El Sheikh in a couple of weeks. The exogenous shocks have been dramatic, and if anything, they have shifted attention away from many of the commitments and pledges that were made in Glasgow. But on the same account, and the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has made this point, these shocks, and particularly the rise in price around gas and energy, could be a silver lining for the energy transformation. That pricing signal, that pricing shock is probably working more effectively than any of the carbon prices that we have in the market at the moment. The other obvious thing is that the UNFCCC depends significantly on international collaboration. Climate is a global issue. It's a classic prisoner, sort of prisoner's dilemma or tragedy of the commons. And without international collaboration, we really will struggle to make progress. But what's interesting for me is to see the emergence of climate clubs. And by that, I mean groups of countries, whether it's the G7 or the EU, really tightening up and saying, look, we're going to set the pace. And if you want to do business in our markets, if you want us to collaborate on other issues around trade, defense, and the like, then we expect our partners to set and meet the same high standards that we do. So climate clubs have become a very important element of continuing to make progress. And then I mentioned the IEA, the International Energy Agency, is very optimistic about an early peak for fossil fuels, perhaps in the next 5 or 6 years or so. But what they've done is they've analyzed the sort of investments. Currently, we're around 1 to 2 trillion investment in renewable energy, their belief is that it needs to be 4 times, in other words, up at around 4 trillion. We are way off that. And so the gap is widening. We're getting worse, but more slowly, I think, is the takeaway there. But what's also interesting to me is to see how the Paris Agreement and the mechanisms within that are being supported now by much more meaningful policy and regulation, particularly in the US, which has always blown somewhat hot and cold on the agreements that have come out of the COPs. The Inflation Reduction Act ignores some of the mechanisms that are written into the Paris Agreement, like carbon pricing, and have gone straight for significant budgets associated with infrastructure development that aims to accelerate, particularly energy transformation across the US. Outside of the US, there are, going back to the climate clubs, groups of countries that have joined the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And what we saw at the Glasgow COP was an announcement that such a partnership had been struck amongst a number of countries, including the UK, for an 8.6 billion funding mechanism for energy transformation in South Africa, which is very heavily dependent on coal at the moment. And the hope is that at Sharm El Sheikh, we will see more of these agreements being struck. And alongside, of course, the issues that you've highlighted, Axel, adaptation in addition to mitigation, and then most importantly, loss and damage are the issues that are going to be on the agenda there, particularly given Egypt is hosting for a continent that only contributes about 4% to global greenhouse gas emissions and really suffers significantly as a result of the effects of a changing climate. We've always paid, and I'm sure that Jill and David will pick this up, paid a lot of attention to Article 6, the collaborative mechanisms that talk about trading, carbon trading as a mechanism to fund mitigation in particular, adaptation to a lesser extent, or to the extent that it's associated with the mitigation problems. And, the net in net zero, which is an ultimate goal of the Paris Agreement, a net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century, is really dependent on having a carbon market that works. And the mechanisms, the 6.2, which establishes trading mechanisms between countries, 6.4, which creates a successor instrument or hopes to the clean development mechanism, really provides these arteries for capital, flows of funding to parts of the world where we do have opportunities to make significant progress at lowest cost in mitigating greenhouse gases. So we'll be watching that. It's not fully formed. We need more. We need more details to make that operation. The company that I'm with, Climate Impact Partners, has played a significant role over the last 20 years in what is called the voluntary carbon market. That is going to be an important engine for innovation and a sort of a runway for a commoditized carbon market as envisaged by the Carney Task Force, now called the ICVCM, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which I see as the beginnings and very fruitful beginnings of an international commoditized carbon trading system, which will then pump prime the arteries and see capital flow. I'll stop there, Axel. Thank you.
Okay, Johnathan, thank you. And look, I want to get into a few of those bits and pieces. I had a fascinating discussion with Annette Nazareth at the Integrity Council not too long ago. Lots of issues to talk about there. Also want to talk about international financial institutions, the World Bank's role, a lot of finger pointing in Glasgow. Want to see how that is going to develop. Look, before we get to the other speakers, let's do the first poll, because this sets the scene and it gives us a sense of where our audience stands. So let me throw out this question now, give our audience a chance to respond. A basic question: what will be the biggest challenges at COP27? One, creating a dedicated financing mechanism for addressing loss and damage. Two, getting assurance from developed countries that the $100 billion climate promised to developing countries will be met. 3, persuading governments to set clearer and stronger plans for phasing out fossil fuels. And finally, getting countries to strengthen their 2030 national emissions reductions targets. So have a crack at that one. We'll come to the results in just a moment. Whilst we're waiting for those, though, let me bring in Jill and David. Jill, a broad question to you to start. This rather narrower focus of COP27, is that potentially a momentum staller, would you say, Jill, or an excuse as a momentum staller, or is it the right thing to be doing now in Sharm?
Well, I think there's a lot of problems for this coming COP, which we wouldn't have envisaged a year ago, as we all kind of huddled together rather cautiously in Glasgow, hoping not to catch COVID. And I mean, I think both you and Johnathan have set out some of the challenges, but we can't get away from the geopolitics of where we are this year and how that might impact on the willingness of countries to take actions, to commit to additional actions. And therefore a narrow focus and a particular focus on finance for Africa, I think is going to be helpful, because we have some big challenges ahead of us that really we couldn't have envisaged last year. So I think, you know, both you and Johnathan have set out that the war in Ukraine has created opportunities for the expansion of renewables. But if you're sitting in Africa, you're seeing Europe buy your gas while not investing in fossil fuels. And that's all about loss and damage. And we need to kind of have that discussion very early on about how we actually help the least developed countries to really accelerate that transition.
Will we see something concrete, Jill, the establishment of a fund, a loss and damage fund, or is that at this stage not likely?
I really hope so, but there are so many problems. I mean, we've talked about Ukraine, but also there's the China-US relationship at the moment as well. There's so many things that are actually obstacles to collective action amongst the parties. And I think what we have seen at Glasgow and earlier is the establishment that Johnathan described of the kind of climate clubs, which I think in difficult geopolitical situations actually does help move things forward. So on the one hand, there's dreadful global picture, but on the other hand, there are some promising things which may actually set the scene for the stocktake COP next year in UAE. The 2022 COP.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jill. David, a quick comment from you before we take a look at the results of this first poll. I mean, when we spoke, excuse me, yesterday, you said, and I think this was your word, it's not a pivotal COP like Glasgow was, and I think everyone agrees with that. But I guess my question is, if we go in with that in mind, are we not starting at a disadvantage?
No, I don't think so. It's what I said was that it's not a pivotal COP in that it doesn't have, you know, a major push on its agenda as, for instance, Glasgow and Paris did, and as a very specific task on the agenda as the UAE had next year with the global stocktake. But I think as a COP, and particularly a COP in Africa, there's a real focus on the issues that have already been talked around, you know, financing and adaptation in particular. But also, I think that Egypt has a particularly important role to carry through what was said at Glasgow, because a lot has happened since then in terms of the geopolitical situation, and countries have they've taken their eye off their focus away from that task. So they've got to bring that momentum from Glasgow through, but also set up for the COP and the UAE's stocktake, because the stocktake is really a pivotal moment for setting the next set of NDCs. So it's an in-between COP in the sense that it sits between these two parts of the process, but there's a real challenge for the Egyptians to stitch all this together and bring it to a successful conclusion in 3 weeks' time.
Okay, good. Thank you, David. Right, let's find out what our viewers think is the biggest challenge. Let's take a look at the results of that poll, if we could. Hopefully, we'll have those with you shortly. As I wait for those, and I'm looking at the screen now, let me throw that question on the international financial institutions out there. And Johnathan, maybe you want to take this one. There was some finger pointing at the development banks. I believe at the World Bank meetings last month, the US and Germany called for a fundamental reform of the World Bank, to properly respond to some of these challenges. What are we going to see anything happen, and why on earth is it taken so long, Johnathan?
Well, it's taken long because it's a difficult process, and we're trying to build a consensus across all countries around an issue that is really probably one of the toughest we'll face in this century. I think, but then focusing down on the World Bank, there are the tensions about the World Bank's, as it were, positioning in the United States and its leadership, and statements that sometimes confuse the outside world as to what the World Bank's real commitment is around climate change. But at an operational level, the degree at which I see the World Bank making its presence felt, there's an enormous amount of work that the World Bank has been doing on building capacity right across the world, and particularly in LDCs, the least less developed economies, to help them ready themselves for, first of all, setting meaningful NDCs and then managing them, and then particularly getting prepared for some of the provisions within the Paris Agreement, particularly under Article 6. In other words, taking control of their NDCs. And the way in which I would judge the bank's influence on that is to look over the last year. One of the bright spots has been the fact that a number of countries, Indonesia, India, Guatemala, and others have sort of said, wow, we've got this NDC. It's a key mechanism that we can communicate our priorities to the outside world. It's almost a prospectus for internal, for inward investment in mitigation and adaptation. We need to know, what challenges they set out for us as countries. And we also need to sort of figure out how we're going to fund those, how we're going to develop appropriate regulation and policy. And I think the World Bank has played a very critical role in helping countries understand that their NDCs are a key instrument. They need to take them seriously. Now, I may have skittered around your question, Axel, but I do want to say that there is a controversial sort of aspect of the World Bank's positioning, but at an operational level, I see them working really hard to try and get the fundamental building blocks of Paris in place and well funded.
Okay. Look, here are the results to that first poll. No great surprises. 43%, the biggest, goes for this creation of a dedicated financing mechanism for addressing loss and damage. So no great surprise there. What the lowest is at 14%, persuading governments to set clearer and stronger plans for phasing out fossil fuels. Maybe there's a little bit of a surprise in that, Jill. I don't know.
Probably not, given the circumstances. So I think last year we probably would have hoped that would have been a big number looking for enhanced NDCs. But I think given, there are some positive things. Australia, for example, changes of government can make a big difference and can give us a bit of a fillip when other things look pretty dire. But I think given the circumstances, that's not so high on the agenda, and I think we're looking for the stock take as a real wake-up call next year, and hopefully in a slightly improved geopolitical situation, or substantially improved geopolitical situation, that will give nations that kind of confidence to go further. And I think at the moment there is a lot of keeping their powder dry, their cards close to their chest, because there's so much else to play for. And in the meantime, I'm hoping that we might talk about the methane pledge or any of the other pledges that came through at Glasgow can start to kind of fill that gap a bit by at least encouraging further action that is required.
Yeah, I mean, you said, Jill, you really hope we're going to get something concrete on a loss and damage fund. I believe Washington has said has sort of brushed that aside and said the focus should be on finding other climate finance that can be used for compensation. We've talked about the development banks, but what are they talking about? Other climate finance? What should we have faith in here?
Well, I think it's really difficult, and I'm very interested to see what they come up with. But I think if you're sitting in an African country, you're selling your gas to Europe, you're suffering the impacts of climate change, you're not getting investment in fossil fuels, and you're sitting on some, then you really do need something to persuade you that this is actually for your benefit. And that needs to be a massive amount of investment in less developed countries in establishing, firstly, a renewable energy infrastructure for them. And we've really, we failed at Glasgow last year to meet the 2020 pledge of 100 billion a year. So we've still not achieved that. That was set back in 2009. So developed countries have really not stepped up to the plate. And of course, this year, with all those financial issues that Europe, North America, and others are suffering, the omens, the stars are not aligned for this, really. But I think there is certainly a vested self-interest in recognizing that investing in renewable energy and other similar projects in developing countries is in everybody's interest. It's money well spent, and we need to find a way of doing that.
David, it's a big question, this, but your views on whether you think the world is actually ready for this transition, and how this might happen, and really whether the 1.5 degrees can be kept alive.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think in terms of readiness, the market reality is that the cost of alternate energy delivery, of renewables, of electric cars, we're starting to see this with hydrogen in the energy system. The costs of all these are coming down, and they've come down to such an extent that it's not a question of being ready. It's a question of just these technologies making their way into the marketplace, which is exactly what's happening. And I think that they're given an additional impetus, actually through the geopolitical situation that we're seeing today, particularly in places like the EU that are immediately affected by the disruption in oil and gas flows. So the world is certainly ready for the transition, because the transition actually has arrived. So it's whether you're ready or not, it's here and it's happening. I think.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
To get to your second point, the 1.5 degrees C, I think the numbers are pretty sobering, and to sort of look wistfully at the COP and go, oh yes, we'll all solve this, is really to be in denial of where we are. So the warming so far is about 1.2 degrees C. And back at the beginning of, in the 6th assessment report, the IPCC made it clear that the carbon budget between where we were on January the 1st, 2020, and 1.5 degrees C had reduced to 500 billion tons. Now you say 500 billion tons, and that's of CO2, that sounds a lot. But just in the 3 years since then, 2020, 2021, and 2022, about 120 billion tons of that budget's been consumed because of ongoing use of fossil fuels. So we're at 380 billion tons, and with no immediate prospect of emissions plummeting, despite the good intentions and despite the NDCs. So we're knocking on the door of 1.5 degrees C. And I think the reality is that we're likely to pass it. However, that doesn't mean that we can't recover from that situation. And this is where the issue of removals comes into the story. And in fact, Article 6 is pivotal for the removal story as well. Because if we can collectively restore the natural system and collectively build capacity around carbon capture and storage technologies, it is possible by the end of the century that we're back under 1.5 degrees C.
Okay. Let's. I want to talk a little bit about some of these mitigation techniques, solutions. I was going to ask you what what technology excites you most, David? Is it the carbon capture and storage?
I think there's a variety of technologies that are exciting. I think the set of technologies around hydrogen are really exciting because they provide a direct solution for a number of areas that are really challenging to decarbonize. And they're as exciting today, perhaps, as wind and solar and electric vehicles were exciting 10 and 15 years ago. They've become mainstream now, but hydrogen hasn't. So I think that's exciting. But I think the key to unlocking this puzzle and limiting warming to as much as possible are removals. We've got to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and that means rebalancing the natural system and introducing some technical solutions to capturing and storing CO2. Yep. So they're not exciting technologies. They're probably going to be essential technologies. I think the exciting technology is what we might be able to do in a hydrogen economy, because that's sort of a real engineering challenge.
Yeah. Look, I'm going to quickly throw the second poll question out, and then I want to come to methane with you, Jill. Second polling question is this: in the context, and look, we're jumping around a little bit, but in the context of ensuring a just transition, which of the following climate finance priorities is most likely to see progress at COP27? The $100 billion per annum climate finance pledge between 21 and 25. We talked about that. A finance facility to meet the loss and damage caused by climate change, and doubling international finance for adaptation by 2025. Those are the three possible responses. So have a go at that. We'll come to the answers shortly. Jill, on methane, you have said, I think it was last year, you said oil and gas methane, very much the cheapest and easiest to abate, and that European states could really set a standard for this. How's all that going? Are you optimistic about that?
There's a regulation that's been proposed. There's a lot of lobbying against elements of the regulation. Europe, has a very complex system, so energy decisions are made at a member of state level. And one of the things that's happened in the fallout from the invasion of Ukraine is there's much more collaboration between member states on what they buy. So there is the potential for them to set standards for the oil and gas that they buy to ensure that there is minimal methane emissions. The amount that's produced in Europe itself is quite low. So it is a very cheap way of doing it. And David will know that there's a lot that oil and gas companies can do to minimize methane, which they've been talking about with governments for 20 years, but not an awful lot has happened in many places. So that is one element. The other element, of course, is agriculture, which is a major contributor to global methane in Europe, is much more significant. And my organization, Environmental Defence Fund, is looking at what we can do in different parts of the world to help with that. I think one of the optimistic things that came out of Glasgow was the Methane Pledge, where 103 countries signed up to reduce global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. A very vague pledge, let's be honest. That number's gone up to 125, but because it's vague, it is much harder to call them to account on and to see where they have got to. What is happening, though, is it has driven some initiatives to focus on methane. And methane is very important because although it's a short-lived gas, it's quite potent. So it's estimated, and I've seen various figures, it's estimated that 25% of the warming that we're experiencing now comes from methane. So if you tackle those very potent but short-lived greenhouse gases such as methane, then you do have a real opportunity to kind of slow the warming process and buy ourselves a little bit more time for the more, some of the trickier elements. So that is quite important. I think one of the things that we haven't seen that we would like to see is some of the big beasts on methane. So Russia, China, India, South Africa have not signed the Methane Pledge. And let's be honest, some of those, given the geopolitical situation, are unlikely to sign this year.
Are we going to get will we get an update on progress of the Methane Pledge in Sharm?
No, I mean, I don't think there'll be anything very specific. One, it's a year in. Two, the pledge itself is quite woolly. And so it's quite difficult. What there will be, though, is that there will be the showcasing, I think, of some of the initiatives, that there have been collaborations between signatories to take action. So I think there will be the start of much more focus on what various states can do to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas, but also from agriculture, from landfill and other sites as well, disused coal mines and so forth. So there is a lot that can and should be done. The other thing I did want to pick up on, though, is hydrogen. Like David, I'm really pleased. Hydrogen will, I hope, have a place in helping us to decarbonize some particular sectors. But Environmental Defence Fund has also, hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas. It can work with other gases in the atmosphere to increase their longevity in the atmosphere. And one of the things that we don't know at the moment, because we don't yet have the instruments to measure the leakage of hydrogen, it's the smallest molecule, a slippery molecule, it's been described to me, though I am not a scientist. So, there is more work to do. And I would say that in my many, many decades of working on climate and energy, alongside some huge successes that we have seen, such as the reduced prices of renewables, there have been well-intentioned missteps along the way. And we can think of the early biofuels or diesel, some things that we have done that have turned out to be not for the good. And I just caution us to make sure that we know what we're doing as we deploy hydrogen. We don't rush in and use it for potentially inappropriate applications. It has a real role to play in many applications, but we need to make sure that we know what we're doing.
Okay. I want to get the results of that second poll. In fact, I think I've got them. Doubling international finance for adaptation by 25, 67%. So that one comes top. And then the $100 billion per annum climate finance pledge. Look, we've talked a little bit about that already. So I don't want to get a reaction to that straight away. David, what I do want to get, though, is your view on the methane piece. Obviously, fingers are being pointed at big energy. Is Shell doing enough on methane?
Well, I think all of the major oil and gas companies have taken the methane requirements very seriously, and Shell, along with many other companies, have very tight methane targets, which we are implementing, and so that's been quite a change over in recent years.
It's not enough, though, is it, David? Really?
Well, let's not forget that the energy system is very, very large, and there are an enormous number of players. If you look at the likes of, for instance, Shell, BP, Exxon, Total Energies, and a few others, you maybe get to 10 or 15% of the world's energy, yeah? And then that's still leaving, at least 80% of other participants. These are all of the large national oil companies, and many of them have adopted methane pledges. But it's also, as Jill said, let's not forget what's going on. We've got all the Russian companies, China, South Africa, multiple other participants in the energy system who are not necessarily providing that same focus on methane. And of course, within that, as well as the coal industry, coal, we don't immediately associate coal with methane, but digging coal out of mines is a significant producer of methane. That's why they used to take the canary into the coal mine. Because the canary would die if there was too much methane emissions, which would mean that the atmosphere in the mine was unsafe and therefore explosive. And we forget about that. Now, I'm not pointing a finger at the coal industry. I'm just saying that there are many, many participants in this chain. And I think that the large multinational companies are really focusing on methane. But it's not enough for just them to do this.
Yeah. All right. Johnathan, both Jill and David mentioned geopolitics, and you've mentioned it as well. And thank you, David, for that response on the methane bit. the geopolitics, okay, Russia, Ukraine, but let's look at the US-China tension as well, and the fact that, as Jill said, China and Russia and others not signing up to the methane pledge. The US-China tensions, to what extent has that really set us back? This bubbling tension, increasingly frothy tension between the US and China.
We shouldn't really forget the fact that it was the US and China partnership that got the NDC review process prioritized for this year. But of course, events overtook that. It's very scratchy. There's no doubt that there is a trade war aspect to climate collaboration. But, you know, as I said a little earlier, I think that the flip side of that, or the silver lining in that sort of breakdown of the global world order that we've enjoyed for the last 50 years, is that we are seeing the emergence of these clubs that are quite nimble in terms of pulling themselves together around particular issues, and it's sort of unleashing a lot more energy at a different level that, in my view, is reason for some kind of optimism. And I'd like to just add to that, you know, pick up on a comment you made earlier, actually in the poll, you know, the 100 billion. My worry is that when we look at this as, you know, the major trading blocs, China, US, Europe, and sort of look to them to give us a steer, that we forget the fact that it's those countries that have struggled for many years to reach that 100 billion target, which, let's face it, in the grand scheme of things, is not a lot of money when you spread that around all the developing economies. So this sort of top-down, this faith in a top-down process that's really going to move the needle, and the fact that it's being fractured is not necessarily a bad thing, because we get speed when countries sort of break away or break out of these established blocks and start to take action in their own right. And again, you know, I just point to, you know, the Energy Transformation Partnership, which mobilized, if you add it all up, probably 10 billion fairly quickly for a deal for South Africa. If we can see those kind of deals multiply and replicate, that'll be great progress in my view.
Okay, send your questions through, by the way, to our viewers. We've got a few bits and pieces on the voluntary carbon markets. So actually, Johnathan, let me just stay with you on that for the time being. You know, I mentioned I'd spoken to Annette Nazareth at the Integrity Council. I mean, there are challenges going forward. The fact that this Integrity Council is so busy is testament to that, I think. What are the biggest challenges now, and to what extent do you think the carbon bit is going to be addressed specifically in Sharm El Sheikh?
Look, you know, I think the issue, and again, I sort of touched on it, is that the only vestige of an international carbon market that prices carbon and that allows capital to flow internationally to projects, mitigation projects that are really going to deliver impact. The voluntary carbon market was, once the Kyoto Protocol sort of somewhat collapsed, and certainly the clean development mechanism was rejected by the EU, it was really voluntary action on behalf of corporates that sort of kept that thing alive. But as David would know, and Jill, actually, you know, it is a really, really small part of the flow. It gives us great, you know, courage and enthusiasm that some of the opportunities to channel finance to mitigation outcomes right around the world developed in the voluntary carbon market have set the stage, have done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of innovation. David talked a bit about the importance of removals. You know, they're engineered removals and they're nature-based removals. Nature-based removals, a lot of work to be done, takes a long time, but those methodologies have certainly been kept alive and scaled to some respect in the voluntary carbon market. My sense of the challenge for the ICVCM and the voluntary carbon market is that there is a slight tendency to over-depend on voluntary action among corporates to really drive finance at scale.
Yeah,
So what I think is sorry, just finish this point, is I think the VCM provides a terrific launch pad, a sort of a runway for takeoff for a commoditized carbon market, which really can scale. When used for compliance purposes. I'll stop.
Yeah, no, interesting. An increased number of people I speak with and the people who lead these companies are saying of offsetting that, and I think actually of a conversation I had with Scott Kirby at United Airlines, who said, offsetting is just a fig leaf for CEOs, and he doesn't want anything to do with it. And that, coming from a leading airline, I thought was quite eye-opening. Jill, is it just a fig leaf for the corporates, or is that a little bit too glib?
I think it has been misinterpreted and used as a fig leaf by some, and it has been used to invest in really valuable projects by others. So I certainly have been surprised where some corporates kind of said that they were meeting their net zero targets maybe 5 years ago by not taking any action at all and buying offsets from others. And that was a clear misunderstanding of what net zero is and should be, which is about action first and about ensuring that you are paying a price for that you can't take action on to incentivize that you get there. In the end, what we need to say is that the ambition is zero. We might not be able to make zero, but it's, the trouble with net zero is it can be misinterpreted. But I think, that the movement of finance is very important, but I think alongside the investment in mitigation projects and projects to enhance the uptake, and we're learning more and more about what the natural world can do for us in terms of absorbing and holding carbon, there needs to be big investment, and I think the pandemic really demonstrated this to us, is the breakdown of supply chains. There needs to be investment in capability and capacity in other parts of the world to allow us to achieve the decarbonisation we need. Africa could provide 40% of the world's solar power, apparently, according to the IEA. It doesn't actually produce its own solar panels or its own batteries yet, though we know it's got a lot of the raw materials there that could do that. We need to be thinking about making sure that we are spreading the means of decarbonisation, the ability to decarbonisation, by investing in projects globally. I don't think the voluntary carbon market can deliver that. It can deliver other projects that are valuable, but the big investment needs to be about a change of mindset, I think, that comes through both and the current circumstances of the supply chain breakdowns that have happened during and as we come out of the pandemic. We're not through it yet by any means, and the Ukraine war. We need to use that knowledge to actually make sure that we have greater resilience globally. And I think an Africa COP is a really useful place to revisit some of the assumptions that I think developed countries have had about investment in Africa in particular in the past, because Africa changes and things that weren't possible 10 or 15 years ago are far more possible now. And we need to be looking at this opportunity and recognizing that at the moment we're presenting, particularly Europe is presenting itself as a continent that is not investing in fossil fuels but continues to use them. So we need to decarbonize faster within Europe, but also ensure that other parts of the world really do have the means to not make the mistakes that we have in the past.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Jill. And David, I want to get your take on the offsets. But actually, before we do, let me just throw the final poll out there and keep the questions coming in the last 10 minutes as well. I am weaving those in. This is the final poll question. In the wake of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the ensuing energy dilemma, which of the following outcomes could be more than just a temporary response and last longer term? A, countries prompted to burn coal, B, acceleration of the renewable energy transition, and C, increased LNG production. So have a go at that. I'll come to the results shortly. Shell's take on offsetting, David.
Yeah, so I think Johnathan spelled this out at the beginning, that, not about Shell, but about the word offsetting. It's the net in net zero. We talk about net zero on one hand, and then collectively the talk about net zero zero turn around and rubbish the idea of offsets. And it doesn't make any sense at all when you think about it. The offset is effectively what's embedded in the Paris Agreement, where it says that it's about balancing remaining emissions, or it's about balancing sinks and sources. So that doesn't mean that you don't reduce your sources, but it's recognizing that you're going to reduce your sources, but there's still going to be some emissions left in the system, and that you match them with technology, or what I was talking about earlier, removals. And that is an offset. You know, unfortunately, the word has picked up some unfortunate baggage along the way. Yeah. Perhaps because of the early use of some of the mechanisms that were in place. But there is no net zero emissions and without a form of offset. And it's Article 6, as Johnathan also said, that delivers that, because it's a mechanism to allow cross-border carbon trade, because it's very likely that where we have the remaining emissions and where the potential for removals exists are not going to be in the same place. So you have to have a trading mechanism to match those. And hence you end up in a world of offsets. But that doesn't mean it's a world of no action. Clearly there's action going on to reduce our use of fossil fuels. That's come about through climate action, and more recently, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has focused people's attention on fossil fuels. It's a bit of a fossil fuel crisis that's emerged from that. And so that's happening. But there's still net zero at the end of that, which you know, at least for this century, is going to be a world of offsets. I think as we look into next century, no, we can have made transition to a completely different energy system, but that's not the case this century.
Excuse me. Let's just get this final poll response, and I can see some of them coming through. I mean, interestingly, countries prompted to burn coal comes in very low, so fewer than I thought worried about that. Increased LNG production 20%, and then renewable acceleration of the renewable energy transmission comes out on top. Look, the other thing I wanted to talk about, if I could, is this idea of more efficient partnerships between the public and the private sector, between policymakers, business, and scientists. How Jill? Let's start with you. How much progress have we made, and how much further do we really need to go on this? Because it seems to me there's still a long way to go.
Well, I'm finding that a very difficult question to answer. I'm inclined to agree with you, Alex. I think there's clearly one of the things that I think has happened over the last 10 years, and I like to be as optimistic as I can on the whole climate question, is that companies have, in some parts of the world, have a much better understanding of what it is they need to be doing, but that is by no means perfect. And one of the reasons it's by no means perfect is because the public sector, government, still don't fully understand what they should be doing on this, and that makes these partnerships quite tricky to establish in an effective way, because they can, you know, it's the missteps along the way that I worry about, and the lack of knowledge and information. We have learned an enormous amount, even over the last 5 or 10 years, about the climate system, about what's happening, about what we can do to mitigate it. Our knowledge is imperfect, and we have made mistakes along the way. And I think all of these things mean that what worries me most is about the wrong signals being picked up by government, misinterpreted by business, and leading to difficult partnerships that exacerbate the problem unintentionally. These are well-intentioned efforts that can take us off course, and I think we need to be really wary about that. looking at some of the things that we can use these public-private partnerships for, and many years ago now, it was about 14 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, actually, which has led to some of my comments today. I was involved in a project that was being led by the UK government with the support of the City of London, various banks in the City of London, called AfriCarbon, to invest in projects in Africa then. It collapsed as Lehman Brothers collapsed, because obviously there was no longer money or willingness to do that. We have moved on a long way since then, but these things are vulnerable, fragile, and if you look at the financial situation in many Western countries at the moment, we are in a similar circumstance. So it's a difficult time to do this. We need to find new ways of making the investments that we should be making now.
But Axel, perhaps can I jump in there? Because I think there's two ways of viewing the public-private partnership. You can sort of force a partnership by, having a very specific collaboration, such as the one that Jill just mentioned, or you can have governments actually putting in a variety of major policy mechanisms that the private sector can react to. And I think that's the better world to be in. And a great example of this, I think, is in the United States, where California put in a low carbon fuel standard. The low carbon fuel standard had within it some hooks around electrification of the transport fleet. And it's basically one of the key mechanisms that brought Tesla from being small to very large, because they used that mechanism to fund the company. And for a number of years, not now, but for a number of years, the profitability of Tesla rested on the back of the California low carbon fuel standard. Now, I don't think, I think if California and a private entity had set out to create Tesla as a deliberate public-private partnership, it probably would have been a spectacular failure. Right. But it wasn't. It wasn't a failure because it was an unintended consequence of a good piece of policy. And I think you see the same happening around things like the emissions trading system in Europe. It's a good piece of policy, leave it alone, stop trying to force it to do things and let it flourish. And this is where I think public-private partnerships can benefit.
Okay, so let's stop trying too hard. It's the message there. Let it happen. Let it happen.
Still put in those big policy pieces, yes.
Yeah. Look, we've only got a few minutes left. So what I want to do with those few minutes is get a final thought from each of you. And you can take this wherever you want, but keep it quite brief. And I'll throw this question out. I'm looking ahead a little bit now, but do we go into COP28 buoyed by what we've seen in COP27? Johnathan, start with you.
Yes, I think we should, but I'm going to take the opportunity just to sort of pull out or sort of focus on an elephant in the room, which is, all the news is good from the IEA. We're getting renewables and we're getting a hydrogen transformation that's sort of becoming almost self-funding and certainly, reaching cost parity. The issue I think we're facing is non-depreciated assets. We've got assets that we've built over the last 150 years. And we've raised debt on those assets. Are we ready to forgive those debts? So in other words, it's fine to put investment, as I've heard both David and Jill say, and I agree with this, into new systems, but we also need to figure out what we do. And it's not just loss and damage about people who've been affected by climate change, but it is, can we forgive those debts and make sure that the repayments that would have been made are going to be focused and join the stream of capital that's much needed. So some of the interesting things that are happening in nature, nature-based solutions to climate, is countries are coming forward and saying, well, what about debt for nature swaps and things like that? So I'm hopeful that some of those mechanisms that really transform our ability to put capital to work at scale are going to be picked up at this COP and progress. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Johnathan. Same question to you, David, and a final question has actually come in from a viewer. So let's weave this in. How can we ensure the outcomes of this COP are actually going to be applied, as we move forward? Are we buoyed next year after this year's COP?
Well, we haven't seen what this year's COP's going to deliver.
Sure, but what do you think?
I think that there needs to be a focus on actually what was delivered at the last COP, which was finally the rule book around Article 6. And this goes back to my previous point about, governments putting in place good pieces of policy that allow the market to react. And if you can operationalize this thing, because what we've seen is a lot of governments have done Article 6 and then they've turned around and says, oh, yes, we like it, but we don't actually want to use it. Well, what sort of nonsense is that, really? Let's embrace these things, use them, and let them channel huge amounts of capital into markets and create opportunities. And that's what's going to have to happen.
Okay, David, thank you. And a final word, Jill, from you. I guess it's me desperately seeking a little optimism as we move this process on.
Well, I hate to disappoint you. I'm managing my expectations for the outcome of COP27. I hope I'm wrong. I think one of the things that will start to get talked about there that we haven't been able to touch upon today is the role of trade policy, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, live discussion in Europe and in the United States, although in a different format there. I think this is going to become a bigger talking point about if you want to sell into markets, what are the standards that you need to meet? We touched upon it earlier on methane and oil and gas, but what are the standards that you'll need to meet to sell into different markets? And I think we're at the beginning of that discussion now, and I think it will come up at COP maybe this year, but it will certainly come up next year. And I think it's going to be very important on how we police a climate regime in the future.
Okay, very good. Look, we've touched on a lot of issues here, and I appreciate Jill as well for bringing that trade piece up as well at the end there. Lots and lots to talk about, but I think we've scratched on a number of these things. So thank you very much to Jill Duggan, to Johnathan Shopley, and to David Hone. Thanks to you as well for responding to the polling questions, for sending in your questions for our speakers as well. This has been a webinar with the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with Refinitiv and LSEG Business. Thanks very much to everyone. We will see you next time.